Hello, beautiful community. Permit me to have a grounding chat with you about Russia and I was going to say Putin's brutal invasion, Trump's attack on Iran. Um, what is the Kremlin reaction? What is Putin thinking? How is it going to impact what the Russians get up to? Is it going to have any impact on Ukraine? And I really would send you out to regional experts for this, but I'm not going to give you a very detailed breakdown of all of this, right? We're not going to talk about how Russia helps Iran to, engage in, the surveillance of its population, make its police state more effective. Just going to try to go big picture, like how should you think about this? Is this, oh my God, the best things ever happened to the Kremlin, or is it a complete catastrophe? And you're hearing both narratives online. You're hearing people say, oh, wow, this is absolutely catastrophic because it shows Russia can't stand up for any of its allies and it's just a complete international humiliation and a total collapse of Russian soft power if it even had any left. And others are saying, well, Trump is behaving in a way that brings us closer to the kind of world that Putin wants to be in. And then yet others are saying that the kind of world that Putin wants to be in is, funnily enough, not necessarily the kind of world in which he will and his regime will flourish. So let's try to ground ourselves. First of all, there is going to be a basic conflict in how the Kremlin reacts, because this is going to be really viscerally shocking for Putin in my analysis. As a 30-year Putin watcher, who is a political philosopher, baby public intellectual, not a country expert, but nevertheless, the quality of my Putin analysis is clear. And my view is that he's going to be really shocked by this in a visceral way. He's also going to think that while it's not entirely clear where we're going to be in 2 weeks, where we're going to be in 2 months with Trump's attack, on balance, this is good news for Russia. Russia is a beneficiary, a strategic beneficiary of this action that is completely viscerally shocking for Putin. So let's break this down a little bit. The idea that most dominates Putin's head, in my view, is what if his regime collapses? And what if, as he thinks is likely, that also entails his personal destruction? Notice that is why his war in his mind against Ukraine is clearly defensive. Because an independent Ukraine there's other reasons too, but an independent Ukraine on Russia's borders increases the chances that when a rocky moment comes, Russia is stepped in the one direction rather than the other, the direction Putin doesn't want. And if that happens and his regime topples, his regime is on a knife edge, and an independent Ukraine next door to Russia helps the regime topple, that'll be the end of Putin's life, he thinks. So he experiences Ukraine as genuinely a threat, so long as it remains a sovereign independent state, to his future self's physical perpetuation. Well, that's why it's genuinely defensive war for him. Now, that is absolutely the number one way in which Putin is going to be triggered by what happened to the Ayatollah. It's worse than what happened to Maduro. Equally bad because it's an external intervention, right, that's confiscating a leader from their post. But in the second case, it's an external intervention that is confiscating the leader's life. And that's really scary for Putin at a visceral level. And you could see how terrified Putin was during the Prigozhin mutiny, even though the mutiny had various kinds of limitations, probably, about how far it could go. But the rational part of Putin's brain introduces a big filter at this point. So this is scary, this is really visceral, and this reminds me of Saddam's end, Gaddafi's end, and this is really shocking, and this is my worst case nightmare scenario, and I'm shocked by this, and I am outraged by this. He is shocked and outraged, because don't forget, Putin doesn't believe that democracies exist, so for him the Iranian regime is no worse than the French regime. You see, we're going to think that it's worse, but he isn't. So for him, it's as bad as Russia going in and taking out the French regime, the French government, I beg your pardon. So that shock is genuine, that outrage is genuine, but there is a very big filter. And that's that Putin is not like the Ayatollah, and certainly not like Maduro, and not like Gaddafi, and not like Saddam, for two reasons. A, he is a major nuclear power, which he does understand makes him relatively safe from this threat. And number two, for all of the limitations of Russian capacity outside its nuclear arsenal, for all of the, relatively small size of its economy, Putin thinks there's the US, there's China, there's me, maybe then there is India and Modi. That's really it. So he doesn't think that the terrible things that are happening to these smaller authoritarian regimes quite translate into his own biography. He is in a different league with different rules. So that's quite an important filter. So that kind of visceral shock doesn't, for Putin, translate into genuine fear that he's going to be next. So it's almost like you sitting behind a relatively safe window and, watching a bear attack somebody's vehicle and, successfully get inside. It looks utterly shocking, but the bear is not going to come for you because you're in a more protected building. So that's the visceralness of it, and there will be genuine indignation. There will be genuine sort of physiological shock. But there is that filter. Let's move now to the strategic picture. The most important thing to understand is that Trump is not perceived by Putin or by Putin's close circle as an enemy. He's perceived as difficult. He's perceived as a frenemy, an ally and a friend, and an enemy in different respects. But he's not an enemy. That's much more important for Putin, and the preservation of that is much more important for Putin than anything to do with Iran. So, if you said to Putin, look, imagine you've got some extra weapons that you don't need in Ukraine, can you send them to Iran so you can shoot down some American planes? Putin's answer is, look, I can have a conversation about various kinds of hybrid and indirect ways of being supportive, but I am heavily disinclined to do anything that's going to mean that I've got to treat somebody who is not my enemy as an enemy just because they attacked Iran. So that's really, really important. And then that leads to a basic point about what the status is. And here country experts are really important, and there are indeed country experts who focus on the Russo-Iranian relationship. I'm obviously not one of them, but what you need to understand is that it's not an alliance in any proper substantive form. There is a considerable degree of cooperation around Russia propping up Iran's repressive state and the various techniques it uses to stay on top of its population. Russia is running a nuclear plant in Iran. Russia has some partnership relations with Iran, but nothing of the kind that would sort of escalate to a level that Russia needed to come to Iran's rescue if it's attacked. That's just not the case. Moreover, that word frenemy we've just used about the United States isn't entirely inapplicable to Russia's relationship with Iran. In many ways, as long as the Iranian regime hangs on and but weakens, Russia would probably prefer that to a stronger Iran, because they are competing with Iran as far as various regional interests and regional pursuits go. They also have a difficult dynamic with the Israelis now because of their weak partnership with Iran. So it's a wash of sort of conflictual and alliance dynamics that the Russians have with Iran, and the complexity of that shouldn't be simplified. And then the depth of the actual and agreed commitments between the two countries should not be exaggerated. So that's roughly where we are. What the Russians would definitely not want is a total regime collapse in Iran and that regime being replaced by something else. What the Russians also wouldn't want, obviously, is some kind of a massive civil war in Iran that spills out into the South Caucasus. But it's important that we basically keep in mind this picture that Putin is shocked and outraged, but we shouldn't overstate the extent of the alliance between Russia and Iran. We shouldn't underestimate the degree to which Trump is viewed as a non-foe in the Kremlin, and we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which Trump doing this, and especially Trump getting bogged down in this, is going to, at least at the level of the political currents that wash across the globe, advantage the Kremlin. Now, people who don't know much about Ukraine and hate Ukraine have been saying things like, well, that'll finally liberate the Russians to truly escalate their war on Ukraine and squash Ukraine into surrender. That's not plausible. The Russians are doing pretty much whatever they can to already achieve that and are having very mixed results. So that there's nothing they can do of that kind. Is there then some further way to jump to this topic now in which the Russians are going to be negatively affected in Ukraine or positively affected in Ukraine by Trump's attack on Iran? Outsourcing myself again to military experts, but roughly the answer is there's not much. There's not much going on there. The Russians are making their own improved versions of the Iranian drones. There is not going to be a huge practical impact. The political impact is advantageous to Russia, but not in the kind of immediate way. What it does is normalize Russia's attack on Ukraine. And the European prevarication on the actions of the United States dramatically weaken the credibility of European leaders when they face their own populations and say, oh, we've got to stand up for Ukraine because the Russians are an evil, malign empire, changing borders in the middle of Europe. Um, but the problem is that that kind of delegitimation of any plausible pro-Ukrainian argument doesn't happen overnight. It happens over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. And in that sense, there is clear political gain there for Putin. What he's done has been normalized, and critiques of it have absolutely been deflated at the level of perceived legitimacy. And not just when it comes to the so-called global south, but actually when it comes to the perceptions of Western citizens themselves. When European leaders can't condemn what the United States is doing, that's very, very harmful indeed for Ukraine. And Ukraine is in a very terribly difficult position here, but that's a conversation for another topic, because of course Ukraine has got to do everything not to antagonize the United States. Now, another question that's arisen online is Russia looking weak, no matter what its actual commitments to Iran are? Is Russia actually looking weak because it's unable and unwilling to do much to support Iran in this situation? And my answer to that is, except on Twitter, no. Russia doesn't have great obligations to Iran. People who know that. General perceptions outside of the West might anyway be that Russia is fighting against a Western alliance and not just Ukraine and Ukraine. So it's fair enough for it to just get busy with that, and it doesn't need to redirect its attentions, because it needs all of them there to prosecute whatever stuff it's prosecuting there. So that's roughly how I see it. I'm afraid to say this is a physiological shock for the tyrant in the Kremlin, who is scared of losing power in a physically visceral way. Cumulatively, at a political level, this hugely benefits the Kremlin over the next half-decade. At a purely practical, pragmatic military level, the consequences of this are relatively minor for Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And what transpires in the region, we still have to wait and see. But in the course of thinking about that, we shouldn't underestimate the closeness of the Russo-Iranian relationship, and shouldn't underestimate the conflictiveness and complexity of it too. I hope that helped ground it. I wish I didn't have to say this. I wish we could say that this is really bad news for the Kremlin in some way, but I'm afraid it just isn't. And I'm afraid that when my government is, and Kirsten faced a difficult decision. I won't talk about that now, maybe that's a separate video. But when my government is providing bases, including in the UK, for bombing missions of Iran, that makes that same government's argument about the awfulness of Putin's invasion of Ukraine harder to justify. And so when it comes to the sort of stuff you believe about the importance of the Russo-Ukrainian threat, the Russo-Ukrainian war as a threat to European security, when it comes to that, all of our arguments have been weakened by this. And this is the irony. Iran is not a threat to the West. Russia is. The United States has gone after Iran because it's got an ill-disciplined, narcissistic buffoon in power. But the real threat that looms for our security is only being disinhibited further by this. So this is not good news. Lots of love.